Hello, and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. I'll be your host for the day. I'm an independent journalist based in Baltimore, Maryland, and my work is currently featured and hopefully will continue to be in Covert Action Magazine, as is that of my co-host and our producer, Shaenah Batterson, who joins me from Eugene, Oregon. Hi, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. It's great to be back for another episode.
Yeah, it's great. We haven't had a guest in a while. And speaking of Cam, we are very lucky today to have a special guest joining us. And you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, Jeremy?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, our guest today is none other than Jeremy Kuzmarov, who is actually the managing editor of Covert Action Magazine. And many of you are probably familiar with him already, but in case you're not, Jeremy is a very accomplished journalist and academic. In addition to being the managing editor at CAM, he's a professor of history at it's the University of Tulsa.
No, I teach at Tulsa Community College and Brooklyn College.
Oh, okay. You teach.
Part-time
Okay.
at each school. Yeah, one course at each school.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. CUNY is actually my alma mater. I went to Hunter, so
Hmm.
um, that's cool to hear. But Jeremy's also the author of several books that are really great, including The Russians Are Coming Again, Obama's Unending Wars, and then also a book called Warmonger, how Bill Clinton's malign foreign policy launched the U.S. trajectory from Bush II to Biden. And actually, his latest book is called Syria: Anatomy of Regime Change, which he co-authored with the last guest we had on the podcast, Dan Kovalik, who and also there's as I understand, the book features a foreword written by legendary film director Oliver Stone, which is really great to hear too. So, yeah, welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for coming on Captive Minds. It's great to finally have you as a guest.
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
So, speaking of your book on Syria, I thought that it might be appropriate to start the discussion there. I was just watching actually the CBS 60 Minutes interview with the new interim president, Ahmed al-Shara, over this past weekend. And the interview was just, blatant propaganda, whitewashing, this previously most wanted terrorist who was had a $10 million bounty on his head, and then has just, since the overthrow of Assad, has just basically appointed himself the so-called interim president. The interviewer, 60 Minutes, did bring up his, past as a member of Al Qaeda and Daesh or ISIS, and even showed him, the infamous poster with the bounty on his head. But they didn't really ask any tough follow-up questions or press him on his beliefs. I mean, overall, it was very uncomfortable and awkward. I mean, he wouldn't stand anywhere near the interviewee, who was a woman. And of course, he was just in Russia at the Kremlin meeting with Putin, and people are debating whether Moscow's going to throw him under the Assad under the bus and extradite him. There's a question about Russia's continuing military presence in Syria. So anyway, my question for you in regard to Shara, or Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, as he was previously known, does your book get into him at all? Because I mean, he did this recent appearance in New York with David Petraeus and this former CIA director, and everyone was pointing out the incredible irony of their meeting because not only the fact that this former Al Qaeda member is is doing these appearances in New York City, but he was actually imprisoned by U.S. forces in Iraq under Petraeus's command back in 2006 when he was an Al Qaeda fighter. So I guess I was going to ask, is Shara featured at all in your book, and do you think that he was pre-selected or groomed for this role that he's now taken on, or what do you think?
That's a good question. Well, yeah, the irony is amazing. I mean, and it kind of undercuts the whole ideology of the war on terror. given that the U.S. helped to empower Al-Qaeda in Syria as well as Libya and other places. So, I mean, I don't, reporters, I mean, it may be understood by some in the public, with, U.S. foreign policy, I don't think has great credibility among a lot of people these days. But others may just buy into these dominant narratives. Yeah, how they're just kind of whitewashing his past, rebranding him as this, reform revolutionary or something like that. But I mean, meanwhile, ethnic cleansing operation and horrific massacres are going on under his direction, targeting the Shiite Alawite population. And this is, yeah, Taliban type regime. And we're supposed to believe that the U.S. was went into Afghanistan to rid the country of the Taliban, and because the Taliban were so draconian, Muslim extremists, and now they're supporting the same kind of regime in Syria. And I mean, the media is largely silent about the atrocities. And there were a few articles in the New York Times, like in March. Well, we were finishing the book in the spring, and there were a couple articles in the New York Times, alluding to massacre. And one was fairly direct in the New York Times, reporting on some massacres going on. Of course, they underplayed any U.S., complicity or U.S. role in those massacres. And as far as the book, I mean, we look at a 40-year, we situate the regime change operation in Syria as a 40 plus year regime change operation, targeting the Assad dynasty and going back even further after World War II, which was the first CIA coup, or even before Iran. A lot of people don't know that
Kawatli,
history.
right?
What's that?
His name was Kawatli, the guy that they overthrew.
Correct, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, we do discuss al-Shara and the circumstance of his release from the Iraqi prison, which is very suspicious. I mean, many believe that he was turned in Iraqi prison and then kind of groomed for this role he's now playing. And who knows if he was subjected to any kind of MK Ultra or mind control experiments, which we know have occurred with great frequency with those agencies. So. And yeah, going back historically, yeah, Kuwatli was the one of the first post-independence leader. He had actually started to forge a good relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, but the U.S. government turned on him because a lot of it had to do with a pipeline. They wanted to build an oil pipeline across Syrian territory, and that would end in Haifa. And Kuwatli refused to go along with that because he felt it would, benefit foreign oil companies and foreign interests more than Syrian interests. And so, that's not what the oil companies and the CIA want, or, the Truman administration is representing oil interests and Wall Street interests. That's not what they want. So he was the target of regime change. And it brought in this guy, Hosni al-Zaim, who then allowed for the pipeline to go forward. Although he didn't last very long in power because he was kind of brutal, crude leader and had no support. Kouatly had a record going back to the era of I believe, the Ottoman Empire. Fighting. He was a Syrian nationalist, who fought against the Ottoman Empire and the French, and then had supported. Um, had fought against the Israelis in the Israeli Independence War, and Hosni al-Zaim was initiated, good relations with the Israelis, and basically was giving the Israelis what they wanted, which was unpopular among Syrians. Especially with the exodus of all the Palestinians from the first Nakba into Syria. So he was seeing it as kind of acquiescent or kowtowing to Israel. And so the Syrian population, he didn't last long in power. And then the U.S., as we go into in the first chapters of the book, the U.S. and CIA were involved in more hidden manipulations to try and install leaders that favored U.S. and Western interest in Syria. But yeah, it was very hidden. It was, not known, even I think among followers of the CIA and critics of U.S. policy, I don't think it was that well known that this preceded the coup in Iran, and there was similar methods and interests behind it, and some similar individual like Archie Roosevelt was a key figure, as well as Miles Copeland.
Okay, yeah, I knew about the coup against Kuwait, but I don't think I knew quite all the. I knew that it was CIA backed. I didn't quite know all the imperial dynamics behind it as far as it paralleling more well-known CIA backed coups like the one against Mossadegh. As far as, I mean, the more, recent war with Syria, I mean, the so-called Syrian revolution that started amidst the wave of wider protests throughout the region that became known as the Arab Spring. Like the protests and the NATO-led overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, I mean, it seems to me at least that they began about at least some legitimate grievances against the Assad government, but then quickly devolved into riots and the burning of government buildings, and featured the involvement of jihadist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and Arar al-Sham, which of course later evolved into or splintered into what became HTS. Um, and then, of course, became an all-out sectarian uprising with the goal of creating an Islamic State. In hindsight, how much do you think that it was organic versus something orchestrated by Western intelligence agencies to destabilize the country and the Middle East at large? Do you think that this was something that was started out spontaneously, that was like seized upon by the coalition of countries that started backing the opposition, or do you think from the very beginning this was all planned?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, we situate as part of a 40-year regime change operation, because Hafez al-Assad came in 1970, and he stood up strongly against the Israelis, and he was more of a nationalist, and he was more a left-leaning leader, although he there was a factional rivalry, and he rooted out the more far left, you can call it, under al-Jadid, but who was put in prison for a long time. But he still was more left-leaning. He was tied with the non-aligned movement. He
Hmm.
developed more nationalistic economic policy, some more socialist-leaning policy with, strong public sector, some nationalized industry. He pushed for industrial development. There were a lot of advances during his, rule. I mean, as far as the living standard, certainly in the home provinces and the, Alawite areas, a lot of economic development projects. And he's, sustained wide popular support. I mean, he was able to balance a lot of the different ethnic groups in Syria and curry favor among them, including the Kurds and religious groups. And he showed respect for different factions. Of course, he faced opposition from the Muslim Brotherhood, often violent opposition, and that was quashed most infamously in 1982 in the Homs massacre.
Hmm.
Although, as we point out, I mean, it was a violent uprising. It wasn't a black and white issue because the Muslim Brotherhood was, even the CIA characterized as a far right organization. It didn't have majority support in Syria, and it carried out violent terrorist acts, including bombing military barracks. And committing atrocities. So it wasn't just one-sided violence of the Assad suppressing it, and that the groups, the CIA documents going back in years are kind of discussing how do we exploit divisions in Syria to undermine the government and destabilize the country. Because I mean, there was a fear of a greater Syria, and that could be a challenge to Israeli a growing Israeli power and hegemony and U.S.-Israeli design to kind of dominate the Middle East. So they don't want strong Syria, and that's what Assad was moving, was strengthening Syria. I mean, he was an effective leader in many ways for Syria. That's why he had a lot of popular support. And his son, I mean, had a mixed record, but and he was moving toward neoliberal policy, but he was still viewed as an authentic Syrian nationalist, uh,
Hmm.
and a bulwark against the Muslim extremists. But the CIA strategy for a long time was to support those extremists. So if you flash forward to 2011, that was a continuous strategy. I mean, yeah, sure, there were legitimate grievances and protests, but the opposition was led by the Muslim insurgents and the U.S. Deep state, the CIA, NED, USAID had been pouring in money for a long time to support civil society groups and opposition
Hmm.
movements against Assad, to support anti-Assad media that was also often anti-Russia, and to inflame opposition against him. So, how do you assess it? I mean, yes, certainly there was disaffection. There were autocratic features, definitely, of his rule. There
Sure.
were, allegations that appear to be true. Torture, human rights abuses, things like that. His economic policy was, moved toward a neoliberal model. There was inequality. There was cronyism. There were, serious problem with the government. So yes, there were people legitimately opposed to him, but there's also these massive programs in place for decades to trigger further opposition, media propaganda, to inflame people, and covert support for Muslim Brotherhood and Muslim insurgent groups. And those were the ones that were ultimately spearheading the demonstrations, starting in Dera, which was like in Libya, the movement against Gaddafi, the heart of the protests, like in Benghazi, it was a city that was the headquarters of Al Qaeda and the Muslim extremist groups in Libya, who had been the chief opposition to Gaddafi, who was a pan-Arab and pan-African socialist, more of a nationalistic leader, kind of like Assad. So, and Dera was also a heart of Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic movements in Syria. So, and yeah, it was really a violent uprising from the outset. That was reported that there was, violence from the beginning, attacks, and the Assad security force, were blamed for committing a lot of atrocities. But in fact, I think Assad was urging caution. And they were incited from the beginning. There were violent attacks. They were getting weapons from Saudi Arabia and attacking, police, attacking, burning buildings, violent protests from the beginning. And there were also counter protests that were pretty big, in support of Assad. And public opinion showed considerable support for Assad vis-a-vis the insurgents. So, to a pattern of history where, yes, there are certain legitimate grievances, but they're a foreign entity who has its own agenda of carving up and weakening Syria, or imposing kind of client ruler who's there to exploit any divisions to his own advantage.
This is kind of related because I know that during Arab Spring, social media played a significant role in sparking a lot of those protests. And do you think that now that social media is used by intelligence agencies as a tool to help foment color revolutions and regime change?
Yes, I think it is. I think there's a pattern. Well, it goes back, I think the CIA and other related agencies in the United States have kind of perfected ways of encouraging these revolts, student revolts. I mean, now we see it with Gen Z, these Gen Z revolts. One has to be a bit suspicious.
Yeah.
About all that's going on. And I think a key case was in Serbia in the late 90s, early 2000, when they organized youth and this Otpor movement to unseat
Yeah.
Milosevic, who had been and yeah, he was not a perfect leader by any stretch, and there were, legitimate reason to criticize him, or to oppose him, but there was really an underlying agenda of the U.S. government to balkanize that region, to establish military bases, and to remove Milosevic, who had been a socialist. and they organized outpour, and they used, I guess social media wasn't in place yet, but they brought youth together in conferences, and they set up propaganda organs and slogans, and they had disseminated the writings of Gene Sharp on how to overthrow a dictator, and they used certain rhetoric, and they made it all seem so noble and inspiring that the youth are, overthrowing the old guard and going to establish democracy. And I think that was the formula going forward. And I think, yeah, they've been more and more savvy in, the last decade and a half in using social media as a vehicle for that. And in my tracking of the National Endowment for Democracy, one thing although they're very opaque and they don't disclose largely who they're financing, it does come out in different ways, some information about who they're financing, and it's clear they're financing a lot of internet media startups to blast their articles on social media to target youth. And these are not objective journalism, the kind we do, where we try and get different sources and different sides. It's just pure political propaganda. And like in the case of Bangladesh, I was following carefully because Stanford University gave an award, and I wrote an article. It was a disgrace because they're giving an award not to a journalistic outlet, but to a political propaganda outlet. And the journalism school is supposed to be teaching students in the ethics and professional responsibilities of journalism, which is to get different sides and different sources, and the opposite of political propaganda. And it's just demonizing one particular the regime that's targeted for regime change is just demonized in these outlets, and that's what occurred with Syria. I found in my research a number of media outlets that the NED was financing. I think one was Al Barada TV, and it was anti-Russia, anti-Assad. So every article is about Assad and how horrible he is, and corrupt, and atrocities. And who knows, some of it may be true, but it's not well sourced, and some of it is not true. And it's just atrocity fabrication. There's a good book by W.E.B. Abrams about atrocity fabrications and how that's used, going back in history to build momentum for war. So they're using those kind of propaganda techniques, and sometimes there's some truth to the allegation, but it's completely one-sided reporting. It makes Assad look like the devil incarnate, just like Putin, or just like the Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. And that's what NED funds. So Syria fits a much larger pattern, and it's very effective. And the American public is kind of insulated, and they become the targets for the propaganda, so they believe it. I mean, the New York Times, they're not reporting on al-Shara's atrocities. We're still getting articles, oh, they've unearthed more.
Yeah,
Uh,
the CBS 60 Minutes interview, she didn't bring that up at all, not once.
Yeah, and we're also getting stories. Oh, they've unearthed some evidence of torture in Assad's prisons, and this is a big article in the New York Times that this alleged torture went on 20 years ago. And some, again, some may be true, but some may not. And then, but they're not describing atrocities going on right now. And so
Yeah.
the public buys into it largely because most of the public doesn't, like us, do a lot of research or reading on their own. They're not a historian. They don't know the pattern of U.S. foreign policy. And so they think Assad, you bring up the name Assad in polite company, and he's a butcher, Putin, Assad, and Maduro. If you ever bring that up at a dinner party or at an academic, bring it up in the academic meeting, or, a cocktail party at an elite university, bring up those names. If you utter anything utterly sympathetic or try to explain to somebody why some Russians might support Putin or why some Syrians support Assad, you'll be excommunicated. It's like in high school, they'll put you with a cap in the corner. You're blacklisted immediately using basically like high school juvenile type rhetoric. And these are supposed to be PhDs, and so.
So Oliver Stone wrote the forward to the book. I guess I wanted to ask you, how did that come about?
Well, Dan Kovalik has worked with Oliver Stone, so yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I mean, speaking of which, we were just talking about Shaenah and I, the Ukraine on Fire documentary that he produced, which is really great intro that I usually show people as far as I mean, there's also the Putin interviews, which are a great accompaniment to that. But he produced Ukraine on Fire about the Maidan and the overthrow of Yanukovych, and you've written a lot about Russia as well. And I know Shaenah had some questions for you about that, if you wanted to ask him.
Yeah, Jeremy, in an article from last year, you wrote about how US private equity firms and as well as some Saudi investment companies have been buying up Ukrainian farmland. So, how do you think Zelensky's avowal of this contrasts with Putin's firm stance against selling off Russia's resources to Western capital, affects the way the mainstream media portrays each leader, as well as the West's somewhat aggressive stance toward Putin?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think the media largely functions, and listeners, probably may be familiar with, Chomsky and Herman wrote a classic book, Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media, which is still, I think, a very useful analysis
Mhm.
and could be applied to this particular conflict. Whereas, the enemy of the regimes that the U.S. designates as enemies. And those are designated largely, as you point out, because the capitalist class may be restricted in their ability to exploit or loot that country. So their leader, is designated as an enemy or a target of regime change. And Russia fits that because even though Putin is not a leftist, in the 90s, Russia was looted by a Western corporation. Its economy was privatized, and even its oil and gas industry, like big U.S. corporation and hedge funds, were starting to gain access, basically start to gain some ownership of Russian oil and gas companies. And they were gaining access to Russian natural resources, and it was just like Wild West. And Putin put a stop to that. I mean, he renationalized. He basically took back a lot of national control over the Russian economy. Um, and so these elements, he became enemy number one because they want to return to the days of Boris Yeltsin. So he's then demonized, and the media just kind of parrots the official government propaganda. And then by contrast, Zelensky has opened up Ukraine to Western business interests and Wall Street interests, which have bought off a lot of its land. And so, he's presented as a hero in Western media. And of course, they've been using Ukraine as kind of launching pad to try and destabilize Russia and do the dirty work against the Russians. So yeah, we've seen this pathetic, hero worship of Zelensky in the media, even though, I mean, he's clearly more of a dictator than Putin. I mean, he barred 12 parties. He'd been assassinating his rivals, and this has been reported in mainstream media that, for instance, the head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine's parliament was assassinated in Moscow Park, and I think Ukraine openly admitted, these Ukrainian commando units and Azov Battalion, bragged about it, and they have this website where they list enemies of the government. Usually, they're journalists who are said to be pro-Russian, or maybe they report some or have some sympathy for peace. And so they're labeled as Russian propagandists, and they're on a hit list. And there have been, they've carried out bombings in cafes and reign of terror. The CIA has been tied to that. They have a huge presence in Ukraine since the Maidan coup. So I mean that is very brutal behavior, and in fact, a lot of the killing that Putin is accused of has never been proven, and is very questionable. And there's even a book by a strongly anti-Russian author, Amy Knight, who acknowledges that there's no direct proof, of all these killings he's accused of, including in Navalny, although her book was written before the Navalny case. But there too, I think even intelligence agencies concluded that there was no evidence to link the Russian government or Putin to that killing. And that's irresponsible reporting. When they report somebody committed a murder, and the evidence, even if you think somebody did it, if he's not been convicted in a court, and if there isn't definitive evidence, it's irresponsible to accuse anybody of a killing. But in the Ukraine case, they've openly bragged about and have a website where they're celebrating the murder of people. So it's completely upside down. But yeah, it does follow the Chomsky-Herman model, propaganda model.
Also, you mentioned the Maidan coup. That brings me to I know the structural adjustment program that allowed American corporations to take over Ukraine's farmland was supported by Zelensky, and he initiated additional land reforms in 2021. Yet the structural adjustment program had been opposed by the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and I know he was overthrown in that coup. Do you think you could tell us about the Maidan coup and how it laid the groundwork for the conflict in Ukraine today?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, exactly as you said. Yanukovych was more pro-Russian. He was standing up to the IMF structural adjustment programs. He was more of a nationalist like Assad. He may have been imperfect leader, but he's more, better leader for Ukraine, certainly compared to the leaders that have come after.
Yeah.
Uh, and, he was enacting some strong measures to stand up for Ukrainian economic sovereignty vis-a-vis the predatory financial agencies and Western corporations. And so, yeah, 2014, the EU and US have been shown to have been behind that. I mean, some of the most incriminating information is the leaked email between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, who was then the U.S. ambassador, and Nuland was in a top position in the State Department. And they were discussing. I mean, it was a blatantly colonial attitude. They're like discussing which leaders should we put in, and then the EU supported somebody. So then they're like, I can't use the
They
language.
wanted Klitschko. They wanted the boxer,
Yeah.
who's now the
So
mayor of Kiev, I believe.
yeah. So they're telling Ukraine who to put in, and then they supported this guy. Now I'm forgetting his name.
Yatsenyuk.
What?
It was Arseny
Yeah,
Yatsenyuk.
Yeltsin, because he was a neoliberal and he was in favor of the IMF program, and that's really what they wanted to turn over the country to Western corporations. So he was their favorite boy, but he only had 1 or 3% popular support, and they ended up support. I think they planned Zelensky because Poroshenko kind of had the look of kind of an old school like Soviet apparatchik, and he was very authoritarian and tied with like organized crime. So he didn't have that image they were looking for. Zelensky was this young, they want to play on the youth, and I mean, they're good at marketing, and really when they're selecting leaders, it's all about marketing and what's the image, and I mean, it's like politics in this country. It's run by the public relations industry, and it's all about image management and what's the image you convey, and you have this hip look, for youth. And that's a good mask behind the predatory economic policies that they want to carry out to have this hip young guy, a former actor and comedian, who, in that case, he starred in these shows where fought against corruption. So he's the perfect vehicle that is going to convey a progressive image when really he's carried out, as you point out, horrific policies that have ruined Ukraine and has driven the youth of that country to their death en masse. And I can't even, fathom the crimes he's committed against his own people in the service of these Western agents. And Scott Ritter, I can recommend his documentary. He made a documentary where he accused or alleged that Zelensky is a British intelligence agent, and some of the evidence he presented was that when Zelensky went to England, he went right to the head of MI6, which was really unusual for a foreign leader. And I mean, he spent all his time begging Western countries for weapons. I mean, if they don't have the weapon themselves to take on a huge country like Russia, I mean, what kind of war is that? Your leader is not out there with the troops, or he's begging foreign country for weapons all the time, and meanwhile, the entire flower of the youth of his country have been killed now, or if they were smart, they fled the country for their own lives. I mean, it's a very sad situation.
Well,
It's
he ran as the peace candidate. I mean, when he ran
yeah.
in 2019, I believe it was. I mean, he was actually, I remember there were Western news articles saying that he was pro-Russian. I mean, he speaks Russian, but compared to Poroshenko, he was the peace candidate. That's why he was elected. And then he did this complete about face once he was in office, and yeah, he was clearly like a wolf in sheep's clothing, or a Trojan horse, and
Hmm.
just he's gone on to be just as much of a warmonger as Poroshenko was, if not more so. And as far as the British intelligence connection, I mean, that's really what was the case with Navalny, because they busted Navalny's assistants meeting with MI6 representatives and accepting money from them. So I know Shaenah wanted to ask you about Navalny and Sergei Magnitsky too, right?
Yeah, I was just
Okay.
wondering if you tell us what you think really happened with the deaths of Navalny and Magnitsky. 'Cause I know both of them, it was made into this big deal, Putin's secret assassination machine or whatnot. It's just, I know you've written about that, so.
Sure. Well, I can go through each story. I mean, a concise overview. The Magnitsky story, yeah, is a complete fraud, and that's how the sanctions started. Obama in his second term came in advocating for a reset policy that would improve U.S.-Russian relations after they'd gone downhill in the Bush years. But then, there was lobbying. A key figure in that whole affair was this guy named Bill Browder, and he is this unscrupulous hedge fund billionaire whose grandfather happened to be the head of the Communist Party USA.
Yeah.
Earl Browder, and I read a book about him, and I think like he rebelled against his family by becoming this arch capitalist. And he was involved in the looting of Russia in the 90s in his hedge fund, and I think he was one of these financiers who was getting onto the board surreptitiously of Russian oil and gas companies, and he was out to loot their resources. And then he got prosecuted for tax evasion by the Putin government, and he invented the story. And he was also involved in a con. He was involved in a $230 million tax fraud and theft from the Russian government. But he spun it around that the Russian government stole money from him, stole the money from him, and then and so he had a vendetta against Putin because basically he was prosecuted, kicked out of the country, and his hopes of getting on the board of these big corporations that own the oil and gas and Russian natural resources was lost under Putin. So he struck back by fabricating the story and using Magnitsky was actually his accountant, although he claimed that he was a lawyer, although he was not a lawyer and never went to law school. And he claimed that Magnitsky was a whistleblower of how the Russian government had stolen all this money from him, and that he was going to tell the story, and he was rotting in jail, and then the Russian authorities killed him. But Andrei Nekrasov was a
Yeah.
filmmaker, did a serious investigation. He was actually anti-Putin, and he had been part of the Maidan protest movement, and was
That's a
against.
great documentary.
Yeah,
Magnificat behind the scenes. We'll put a
yeah.
link to it.
I think it's available, although it was basically blacklisted, and they were supposed to have an event in Washington, and they canceled the event and basically removed the film from circulation. So it's very difficult to obtain, although you may be able to get it through the filmmaker's website. Anyway, he found that the whole story Browder told was a fraud, that Magnitsky was an accountant. He was in on Browder's money laundering. In fact, he specialized in helping wealthy people to offshore their money. And he was helping Browder offshore his money and to commit various forms of corporate crime, white collar crime. And that's why he was imprisoned. And actually, he was more valuable to Russian authorities because he was helping them ultimately with their case against Browder. He was not a whistleblower of any kind. And then his death appears to have been based on illness. He had a series of health ailments. And it was shown in the film that the Browder story that he was beaten up by prison guards was impossible. Browder had claimed like 8 guards entered his cell, and yet it was too small a cell. And just the story Browder told didn't make any sense. But Browder had the money, he through the Ziff brothers was a big donor to Senator Ben Cardin, who was a key sponsor of the Magnitsky Act. So after Magnitsky died, they made like he was a martyr and he was a victim of the Putin, brutal dictatorship. And then he lobbied through sanctions. He funded politicians who pushed through the Magnitsky Act. And I think Dick Cheney's former like press secretary went to work for Browder or something like that. Like he got some high profile people. He cultivated alliances on Capitol Hill and he pushed through they got the Magnitsky Act passed and that poisoned US Russian relations and set the groundwork for the new Cold War and it was based entirely on a fraudulent story. There was no real legitimate basis for the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and that set the groundwork for the Maidan coup 2 years later and Browder has been a staunch, he's been a constant presence in the media, and for some reason they always quote him as an authority, and he makes the most, worst claim. He smears Putin constantly in the media, and he's presented as some kind of credible source. And he was the source who claimed, Putin was the richest man in the world, and that he stole all this money. And it turned out there's no evidence of that, and that Browder had just said something once and made stuff up, and people picked up on that when there's no concrete evidence of it. And that's the kind of yellow journalism we're seeing, including with Assad. He's accused of the worst, most diabolical crime. I mean, he was even accused of heading a drug empire. You can see the common propaganda because they're claiming Maduro is the head of a drug cartel. And that's going to be the justification for ramping up the regime change or military operations in Venezuela. And they were accusing Assad of being the head of the Captagon, this major drug trafficking ring. And they just spread these stories, same kind of stories against these leaders, make them seem to be diabolical evil. And the public often buys into it because they're not well informed about world events. You have to really do some library reading or research to have a better understanding of some of these countries, which most people are too busy to do. So they get away with it, unfortunately. And then with the Navalny case, yeah, it was just, because they're trying to find a new Yeltsin type, or, a leader that could be a proxy of the United States or, you know, and so they owned in on Navalny because he was this young guy who seemingly had a big following, on social media and with the youth of Russia, although really he had very limited support. But he had been a fellow at Yale University, and actually his politics were extremely regressive, and that fits a wider pattern. He was associated more with the far right, ultra
Yeah.
nationalist, even skinhead groups in
Hmm.
Russia, and he was featured on some videos calling immigrants cockroaches and like came close to praising the Nazis. So this is a pretty despicable guy, and his brother was involved in all these illicit schemes to defraud a company like Yves Rocher. It was some kind of scheme, mail fraud scheme that Alexei appears to have been involved in. And he was also accused of embezzling money from various political organizations. And that's what landed him in the legal system. His brother, Oleg Navalny, got a long sentence, and he got many experts. I mean, I'm not a Russian expert or who lives in Russia and has viewed all the documents in these legal cases, but there are a couple journalists who are, and they came to the conclusion that Navalny was guilty, that he was not a political prisoner, that he was involved in white collar crime with his brother. But he was made up, just like Magnitsky, to be this political prisoner, prisoner of conscience, and all the human rights groups just played into it. And that's, a good book called The Human Rights Industry by Alfred de Zayas. And it's
Yeah.
become this industry in support of regime change rather than objective reporting. And they present and they're used as go-to source in the media. You know, the media mainstream doesn't do any of their own research. They'll just refer to Human Rights Watch report or Amnesty, and that the source. If they say it, it has to be true that he's this prisoner of conscience, and they never looked into his legal case. Um, and so, yeah, he was billed as this kind of martyr, persecuted political dissident. And then there are these poisoning incidents that were really fishy. You know, they claim that he was poisoned in a Russian hospital, and then they took him to Germany. But the people at the hospital says he was not poisoned. You know, and it was supposed to be Novichok poisoning, which is like the worst. Novichok is deadly if you're exposed.
Worse
You're
than
gonna,
sarin gas. You can't get any, if you even touch somebody that has, it's like, the
yeah.
whole story made no sense.
Yeah, and somehow he survived a week in a Russian hospital, and they decided, oh, we'll send him to Germany. And only then, it was only in Germany that they find that he was supposedly had been poisoned with his Novichok, or sarin gas, but he survived, and it was in his underwear or something. And I forget all the detail of the
Well,
story,
the
but
story changed. First, they said it was in the cup of tea that he drank, and then they said
yeah.
it was in his clothes. I mean, it just,
And then the people at the hotel, if the story would have been true, anybody at the hotel who touched that glass or the cleanup crew would have been impacted. It's similar to this with Assad. I mean, we're talking about propaganda against Assad. They met, and our book goes into the fabrication of the chemical weapons attacks. The scenes were clearly staged. They had rescue workers who were photographed wearing no protective gear and faced no health problems after the supposed major weapons attacks. And then you had a top MIT scientist studied it, Theodore Postal, and he said if there was an attack, it had to have come from the rebel-held areas. You know, he analyzed all the physics of it and the angle. And this is like a top scientist at MIT who had been a weapons advisor.
Ted Postal, right?
Yeah, Theodore Postal. I interviewed him, and then they countered, like they smeared Postal in some of the news articles, and even the alternative media. And as a source, they cited Bellingcat, which is like an intelligence agency run website. And the head of Bellingcat, who is the main source in all these articles refuting Postal, didn't even have a college degree. He had like failed out of college, and like they asked him, what is the extent of your scientific knowledge? And he said, everything I know is from playing Xbox or something. Like he admitted he knew nothing about science, and yet they were trying to refute Postal by citing him as some kind of scientific authority that Postal's scientific assessment was somehow wrong. It was ridiculous, but they billed him in the media as this, I guess the average reader wouldn't realize that he knew nothing about science, was not a college graduate. And so I don't know. I think the public, a lot may have believed it, but it's similar. They're creating these stories. It's like the Skripal case as well. Like they use the same techniques. Like they make a Putin or Assad the most evil in the world because they use these, alleged, chemical poisons and chemical attacks. And yet, when you scrutinize the stories, they make absolutely no sense at all. And so, I mean, yeah, it is kind of amateurish, but it does seem to work. They get away with it time and time again, unfortunately.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit, just because of recent news. I know back in 2023, you wrote an article about the mysterious death and the alleged suicide of the legendary gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson. And I saw recently in the news that the case was reopened. And I remember I used to read his ESPN column regularly at that time and thinking that it was so unexpected when he supposedly killed himself. And I do remember at the time he was very, very critical of the Bush administration. And I mean, he was really singling out the neocons as like this unique evil. And so I saw that the case was reopened into his death. And what do you think about that, they're reopening the case?
Well, yeah, I was happy when I saw that as well. I think his wife pushed for the reopening of the case because apparently when he supposedly committed suicide, he was on the phone with his wife and like mid-call, he just suddenly, I mean, that's not usually how people commit suicide. He's having like a normal conversation with his wife and not, showing any signs of distress. And then I guess something went off on her end of the phone. And according to the official story, he just suddenly takes a gun out and shoots himself. And it just didn't make sense to her. And there are other features of the story. These stories, like we're saying, they often just don't make common sense, and this is a guy who had everything to live for. I mean, uh, you know, he was kind of revitalizing his writing career. He had a beautiful young wife who was a lot younger than him. I think at the time his son was in staying with him in his home. He had a new grandson or something like that. And so, I
Mhm.
mean, why would this guy kill himself? He's living a great life. He has everything to live for. And, and then you find out that, yeah, he was probing into the 9/11. I mean, now stuff is, after 25 years, now stuff is starting to get out more in the open, like with Tucker Carlson. Uh, and I think younger generations are, they don't have the same baggage. They didn't live through that period when, we were attacked. If we mention anything about 9/11, they immediately attacked us. And as you
Yeah.
said, the devil, we're, and so, people just like internalize that, and they don't even talk about it anymore because they want to enjoy their life and not be blacklisted or, lose their jobs or careers. But the younger generation, they didn't live through that baggage. They don't care. And they look at it and it makes no sense to them because, even like a 13, once you reach a certain age, if you have any, and kids are smart, they see, wait, that doesn't make any sense. How did the building seven just
Yeah.
falls hours after, and no plane hit building seven? How did that fall? Muhammad Atta's passport, somehow there's a fiery crash and somehow his passport is found.
Yeah.
So he's the culprit. I mean, like a child starts to ask questions. So this generation coming up, so and now they're starting to spill the bean, more mainstream. I mean, Tucker was, exiled from Fox, but he has a huge online following, and when he starts to discuss it and bring stuff out, it's starting to reach middle America, and that's where we're at now with 9/11. So, but at that time, back to Hunter Thompson, he was a kind of pioneer in probing into this, and he was the king. I think he would be a threat because this was a legendary writer. It's not, you or I writing on some kind of fringe website where it may not have much, many viewers. Not to underplay the kind of work we do. We're trying to reach a wider audience, but still
Oh
we
yeah,
make.
he had a huge
But
ESPN coverage
Hunter Thompson, I
on it.
mean, this guy's a celebrity writer. He's one of the most famous American writers, and so if he's probing into this, it's going to have a huge impact and everybody will be talking about it. And so that may be that appears to probably be the motive. But the crime, the evidence looks like clearly it was a murder, not a suicide.
I mean, you cover really like a variety of topics in your work. I mean, you also did a great article on the Oklahoma City bombing, and I know you're in Oklahoma yourself. So just anecdotally, I was just curious, like locally, like what is I mean, that's sort of like the local nine equivalent of 9/11, I guess. I mean, what is I think I saw an interview with you about that article, and you were saying that like even like the guy, like your doctor's office or something, was telling you he thought it was like there was federal involvement possibly with that case. I mean, there's the great documentary A Noble Lie about the Oklahoma City bombing. So I just wanted to ask you about living down there, what the local consensus is in regard to that
Yeah,
bombing.
well, because I moved there because I got a teaching job there. And yeah, I didn't know anything about the Oklahoma City bombing. I just didn't think twice about the official story of McVeigh as this lone nut, nationalist white supremacist, until, yeah, I met people. And some, had lived in Oklahoma City at that time, and they told me, oh, there were two blasts, and they said the official story is all false. And yeah, my chiropractor would talk at length about it, and he introduced me to that film. And then when I started, working for the Covert Action, I thought, oh, this would be a good story for that outlet since they're interested in covert action. And I ended up meeting a former Tulsa police officer who was actually well, he wrote a book, so I contacted him, and yeah, he was a 27 or something year veteran of the Tulsa Police Force, and the FBI asked him at that time, the FBI asked him to investigate and write a report about the Oklahoma City bombing, and then he wrote a report, but the FBI suppressed his report, and basically he was encouraged to retire at that time, and so he ended his policing career. And then he wrote a book, and he teamed up with. It was an odd mix because this guy's, I think, conservative libertarian, and he was working with David Hoffman, who was editor at one point of the Berkeley Barb, who had been in the Berkeley free speech movement, and the two of them were working together to research this topic, and they each ended up publishing books. So these books are very well documented, though they're with kind of obscure presses, so they didn't get, I don't think, a wide public reading, but they're extremely well researched, showing that the official story is false. That I mean, right away, the fertilizer bomb that Timothy McVeigh had could not have destroyed the building, all in the way that it did. All the scientific experts that each of these authors interviewed and numerous ones, others also came forward to say that's a scientific impossibility, and that yeah, there were two bombs, two blasts are known to have occurred, not just the one in the Ryder truck, and it believed to be military grade explosives planted in the building. And that appears to have been actually the preview for the destruction of World Trade Center 7, which experts and researchers on that topic believe it was planted explosives within inside the building. And there are other parallel and high-grade military weapons. And there are other parallels, including destruction. They destroyed the building in both cases and the crime scene, so there couldn't be proper investigations. And in the Oklahoma City bombing case, what I learned is that McVeigh had been in a special unit of the Special Forces, and they claimed officially he had left the military, but actually there was evidence he was still in the military long after they claimed he had left. And then he gave a confession to his cellmate who wrote a book that the story was he was told to be on some kind of special mission, and he was told where to go and what to do. And there are signs, if you study like the Kennedy assassination, that it's not that different from Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was set up as a patsy and he thought he was working in some kind of secret military project, in part to infiltrate the white supremacist groups in northern Oklahoma. But, they were telling him where to go and what to do. And he may have been entirely innocent. They were just telling him to drive the truck and be here. And because, he got his escape, he got out in a car with no license plate, which was set him up to be caught. And, he wasn't nervous, like, because he thought his
He
captain
went
was
and
going to
ate at
come.
McDonald's, right?
What's that?
Didn't he like go and eat at McDonald's afterwards or something that they claim? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, well, he got in a car with no license plate, which ensured the police would stop him. And then he was very calm when he was arrested and even in jail because he thought his major would come get him from jail. And he didn't, I may not have even known that there had been a bomb, I don't know, in the Ryder truck. Or by that point, he may have known the bomb went off, but he thought, he thought he was part of some kind of operation and they would protect him, which obviously they didn't. So I learned all that. Yeah, it was good that I guess I moved. The only job I got in academia was in Oklahoma, and I'm glad in hindsight I moved there. So
Yeah, I've always been sort of partial to the whole Ramsey Youssef connection just because McVeigh and Terry Nichols didn't have any bomb expertise, and like the parallels between the 93 World Trade Center bombing and the Oklahoma City bombing are just so similar. And then like the fact that they had no expertise, and then they were they were going to the Philippines where Ramzi Youssef was, and they were spotted there by like some informant or something. But anyway, I guess my last question, unless Shayna also has something to ask you, is
I do.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Regarding the relaunching of CAM. I mean, I know it used to be it was start for those who don't know, it was started in 1978 by former CIA officer turned whistleblower Philip Agee, along with the legendary attorney William Kunstler and others, and then became as Covert Action Information Bulletin, and then it became Covert Action Quarterly, and then there was a period of dormancy, and then it was relaunched as Covert Action Magazine, an online site, 2018. I just was wondering how that came about. I mean, I know it might be too big of a question. You might not have time, but um,
Well, I mean, yeah, there was a decision to relaunch the magazine because it had been a successful print magazine. And then I think, Philip Agee passed away and the founder in 2008 or 2009, and it kind of went dormant. But, Lou Wolf was a journalist who's worked for the magazine from the beginning and was close with Philip Agee, and he was among those who wanted to restart it with Philip Agee's son, Chris Agee, who had worked on it, helped out with the magazine as a youth and stuff. So there was a group that got together with a plan to relaunch it. Since it was an important magazine that critically covered U.S. foreign policy, and there's not really any other magazine like that, and also critically scrutinized the intelligence agencies. And that's certainly urgently needed now. And these agencies have gotten more and more out of control. And with, as evidence with the Russia Gate, for instance. And now, I mean, Trump is openly ordering the CIA to be sent to Venezuela.
yeah,
Uh, and now maybe that, the New York Times today had an article uh, about that, but it was like a historical piece. Is like, are we going to return to the days of, the Bay of Pigs? And like they went, here are some major CIA covert operations in South America, and they went into Guatemala, Bay of Pigs, Chile, and it was pretty critical of the history. Like it wasn't entirely sugar-coated history. I mean, they maybe left some dirty stuff out, but it was overall pretty critical of those operations. So, uh, but I mean, I think younger generations don't necessarily have that consciousness. I mean, they suppress teaching in school because I taught courses on the CIA at various universities, but I was very, let's just say, shabbily treated at those schools by the administrators or other faculty, where the students were very interested to learn the history, like what I was saying with 9/11, and they pretty skeptical and happy to have a critical kind of unvarnished history, but the power that be don't want that history taught. And so you have gaps in knowledge. I think a lot of younger people don't know it. The only people who may know the history are those who lived through the church hearings and, that
mhm,
era of the early 70s. A lot came out, was disclosed publicly and horrified the public. And so I think they've spent the last 30 years trying to cover up that ugly history while quietly revitalizing these agencies and doing more. I think they do a lot more now within the United States, even than in the past. So, but it has now people. I think a lot of people actually on the right are, they are very skeptical. They're often the ones doing the most probing, or criticizing the so-called deep state the most. Tend to be, I find these days, more right-wing or libertarians, and libertarian website like the so-called left-wing alternative media has been often awful with covering the
yeah,
CIA or acknowledging CIA involvement, or whether it's Russiagate or yeah, I think we see eye to eye on that. So that's why I think it's another reason covert action is so important today. In some way, it can transcend, although it is rooted in the left, but it has a tradition of being a independent, independent journalism and investigation of the intelligence agencies, which is not being done in other left-wing outlets. So.
Yeah, it seems like it's what do you think that now I feel like it's sort of painted that criticisms of the CIA and covert action is now almost in some ways painted as being some sort of right-wing thing. And how do you think that shift, do you think that shift in attitude on the left has anything to do with the CIA's domestic operations like COINTELPRO?
Yes, I think so. I think a lot of alternative media is infiltrated by intelligence agencies, and I think there's a mission A of preventing any left-right unity. I think the ruling oligarchy, which the CIA, and that was one of the core insights of Philip Agee, was that the CIA was a kind of instrument of the ruling oligarchy and so-called 1%. They weren't just rogue actors. So I think their purpose in infiltrating left-wing media is to prevent any unity between left and right, because that would really challenge the power structure. And yeah, number two, to pigeonhole or label critical investigations into the intelligence agencies as right-wing analysis, and that then the left will distance itself from that, and then it won't become as it could be kind of associated with more fringe right-wing groups. And they were doing that like with the COVID and with the January 6th. You didn't find any analysis like in the Counterpunch type publications that critically scrutinized the role of intelligence agencies may have played in January 6th in the COVID affair. And even those outlets, because we have a chapter that on intellectuals and the Syrian war, which was a chapter I wrote, and it was very critical of liberal intellectuals. And my argument was that they realized that the so-called deep state or intelligence agencies realized that the key to neutering any opposition to this regime change operation and gaining, strong public consensus was to co-opt left-wing intellectuals or those who identified more on the left or in academia. And they were the ones that were basically parroting the government line, and they were often the most vicious and malicious in attacking genuinely independent and critical analysts when it came to Syria. They were the ones who used smears like Assad lovers and surveying the coverage like on Counterpunch right after the so-called Syrian revolution, December 7th of last year. They ran a number of pieces, basically attack pieces against independent journalists who were critical of U.S. involvement in Syria, and they were denying that, and they were using term like tankies. They're trying to compare them to leftists in the Cold War who had supported the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic and Hungary in 1956. So they were using that kind of rhetoric, and I'm sure that that comes from the intelligence agency. They want to associate them. I mean, that was always a technique, like in the Cold War, to associate the left with Soviet invasion of Hungary. So they want to associate anti-war dissenting groups with the Assad government, and that was also in magazines like the New Yorker and Mother Jones. They had this guy Shane Bauer who was very
Oh
prominent on
God.
Democracy Now, and he would
Yeah.
carry out these kind of attacks and basically parrot government propaganda. And he's been accused, the Gray Zone accused Bauer of being an intelligence agent. I don't know if that's true, but it wouldn't surprise me if we would learn that somebody
I
like
know he
that.
was suspected of, I think he was like detained by Iran or something like
Hmm.
that. But yeah, Shane Bauer is awful. He's one of the worst.
Yeah,
And
so I think
Counterpunch,
this would be
they
an
purged
example. Well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, I think your Cam is like one of the last bastions of like this kind of old left, that's really critical of intelligence agencies and that Counterpunch used to be when it was under Alex Coburn as the editor. I think that Cam is really doing important work and it's, that people should really support if you're watching and listening, if you want to read articles about everything from Oklahoma City bombing to the so-called Syrian revolution to the mysterious death of Hunter Thompson. I mean, where else can you read that? It's these days. It's very, very few and far
Hmm.
between. And I think that you're doing really good work at CAM.
I
Oh,
think it's ironic that the term tanky gets resurrected to discredit things because now, with the when Trump declassified the JFK files, there was evidence showing that the CIA was involved in supporting the so-called Hungarian Revolution. So then it becomes a bit of a historical irony that then that's the terms used to discredit people concerned with CIA involvement in things.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And yeah, maybe you can write an article about that.
I'd like
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, that
Okay.
would be a good article because yeah.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I mean, we could talk to you all day, but I know you've got a busy schedule. So thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this is a great discussion. You're doing really good work. And yeah, Syria Anatomy of Regime Change. Is that out now? It's out,
Yeah,
right?
it is available, yeah.
Okay. And then yeah, you've got lots of other great work, and it's covertactionmagazine.com. Thank you for coming on. Well, Shaenah, do you have any final thoughts or anything? Or
I just want to say thank you for joining us. It was really great to have you.
Absolutely. Likewise. Great to be with you guys and glad both of you are writing with us with Covert Action. So look
yeah, I
forward
mean,
to
speaking
keeping
of
working
9/11,
together.
I've
Yeah.
I've got I'm working on a piece on 9/11 right now, related to all the revelations, and
Oh,
Shayna's
good.
working on stuff, and
Yeah, I think
people,
it's
we need more people doing this.
yeah, absolutely. And people who are independent, nonpartisan and yeah, willing to try and expose these corrupt elements.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And yeah, you can remember to hit like and subscribe. We have a YouTube channel. If you're watching us on Substack, it's Captive Minds Pod. If you're watching us on YouTube, our Substack is shaenahbatterson.substack.com. We'll be back for another episode of Captive Minds. Thank you for watching.